The gavel split the hush like a rifle crack, and every breath stalled in the courtroom. Jordan Hale flinched, a 34-year-old male whose courage had been ground thin by months of threats. Judge Elias Carter said, "Order," and his 62-year-old voice carried a weary iron. A red flash drive slid across polished oak, thrown by a trembling clerk who had run out of silence. Mara Quinn said, "Stay seated." And the 40-year-old female attorney kept her eyes on the judge. Victor Lang said, "Irrelevant," and the 45-year-old male prosecutor wore a smile that never reached his eyes. The affidavit inside the sealed packet named the fabrication, and the trap Jordan had sensed showed its teeth. Nora Bell said, "Sworn testimony cites altered access logs," and the 28-year-old female clerk's voice shook. Jordan said, "That is my login, but not my night," and the words tasted like rust. The gallery leaned forward, drawn by the gravity of a life about to tip. The judge studied the drive as if it might bite, then nodded to the bailiff, and the chain of custody began. Jordan gripped his worn notebook, feeling the groove where a pencil had carved the word truth. He understood the cost waiting behind that word, and he did not look away. The shock faded, and the ache arrived, the kind that lingers in the ribs like a bruise. Jordan walked out beneath the courthouse frieze, with the weight of a city on his back. Mara Quinn said, "You wanted truth, now it wants you back," and she held the door as if it were a shield. Jordan said, "I did not light this fire, but I will not run from its heat," and his voice steadied as he spoke. He had filed the first report alone, at a kitchen table scored by years of bills and coffee rings. He had seen the ledgers bend, the numbers lie, and the harm roll downhill toward people who never asked to be brave. Victor Lang had already named him reckless, faithless, and hungry for fame, but hunger was not what kept him upright. He thought of a night shift nurse who lost her pension, and a janitor who paid fees for a service that never arrived. He thought of his father's advice, and how a man is the promises he refuses to break. Mara said, "They will dig into your past," and he said, "Let them dig, my hands are clean." The city wind tasted like iron, and the winter sky sagged as if it knew a storm was coming. Night brought no rest, only a new chorus of threats layered over the hum of the fridge. Jordan stared at his apartment window where the city lights scrawled uneasy lines across the glass. A blocked number said, "We know your building," and static ate the rest. Mara Quinn said, "Record everything," and her text stung like medicine. Jordan said, "I will not be moved," and left the phone face down on the table. He opened the notebook and wrote the names of those who would be hurt if he failed. He remembered the data room, the missing entries, and the supervisor who winked when a file vanished. He had crossed a line when he refused to look away, and lines have a way of turning into fences. A siren passed, then faded, and the old radiator ticked like a metronome of doubt. Jordan said, "If they come, they will find me standing," and the room felt smaller but steadier. Somewhere, a printer rolled, and his resolve inked itself again. The morning carried frost along the railing, and a hard clarity with it. Mara Quinn said, "We go on a fence," and slid a secure envelope across the table. Inside lay a timeline, a contact list, and a name circled twice. Liam Cross said, "You asked for daylight," and the 38-year-old male reporter spoke through a guarded smile. Jordan said, "We expose the pattern, not just the trick," and tapped the missing hours that had seeded the fraud. He pictured the accountants who had whispered in empty corridors, and the server logs that pulsed like heartbeats. He understood that truth needed staging, or the crowd would miss the wound for the scar. Mara said, "You will not speak to anyone alone," and he nodded because pride had lost too many cases. They plotted a path through the maze that would keep evidence pure and courage intact. The frost melted on the window, and a pale sun tried to convince the city to forgive itself. Jordan said, "We move before they decide how to stop us," and the day finally began. By noon, the first leak had a pulse, and the rumor mill began to grind. Victor Lang said, deflection on a radio clip that hissed through a cab's cracked speaker. Jordan stood on the courthouse plaza where pigeons broke like gray surf against the wind. He felt small and exact, like a nail driven clean into oak. Mara Quinn said, "Stay measured," and her calm drew a sharper outline around the storm. A security guard watched the steps as if history might try to sneak past him. A camera crew rolled up late, and Liam Cross said on background first, keeping his voice low. Jordan said, "The numbers are not just numbers," and the words caught, then steadied. He told the shape of the harm without drawing the face, and the plaza listened because the cold forced honesty. Somewhere an office door slammed, and somewhere a hard drive spun up. The city inhaled, waiting to choose a side, and the sky held its gray like a secret. The war room smelled of toner and cold coffee, and the city beyond the window blinked like a restless jury. Mara Quinn said, "We subpoena the backup tapes," and stacked color-coded tabs like a chess player. Jordan Hale said, "They will bury us in paper," yet his voice held a stubborn edge. Liam Cross said, "Public interest is a furnace, feed it truth, and set a recorder beside a legal pad." Nora Bell said, "Chain of custody starts at the server cage," and traced a date that had been shaved thin. An anonymous email chimed and delivered a screenshot that looked like a match held to dry straw. Victor Lang said, "Protective order filed," in a message that wore a grin between the lines. The log showed a ghost login at 2/7, stamped with Jordan's credentials, and a deletion that erased pain by the hour. Jordan said, "That is the night of the Grant meeting," and the room learned a new kind of quiet. Mara said, "We will not touch hacked material," and her caution moved like armor between them and disaster. Liam said, "Then verify it another way," and tapped the power of witnesses not yet brave enough to count. Jordan felt the rhythm of fear and duty, and chose duty again. The city neon washed the glass, and the plan sharpened like a blade. The garage sat under the courthouse like a rumor with bad lighting. Jordan Hale met Dan Mercer, a 36-year-old male analyst who once split sandwiches and secrets with him at lunch. Dan Mercer said, "You are in over your head," and his glance kept bouncing off the concrete. Jordan said, "Then stand beside me," and watched Dan's right hand freeze a beat near his belt. The rain above drummed a verdict that no one had earned yet. A slit of chrome under Dan's jacket caught the sodium glow, and the betrayal announced itself without words. Jordan said, "Take off the wire," and Dan froze harder, then sighed like a punctured tire. Dan Mercer said, "They will end you if I do not help them," and the echoes stacked the lie 3 times. Jordan said, "You were better than this," and the sentence hurt to finish. A sedan idled 2 rows over, pretending to be a wall. Jordan walked away because rage would feed the trap, and traps like clean appetites. He left footprints in a chain across the slick floor, and hope lost a little of its voice. Morning carved hard light across the courtroom, as if truth were a blade that could be shaped by heat. Judge Elias Carter said, "On the motion to suppress, proceed," and the room leaned toward him. Victor Lang said, "The defense peddles tainted logs," and tapped the lectern with theatrical restraint. Mara Quinn said, "We seek limited discovery, not gossip," and laid out a clean path from server to signature. Nora Bell said, "These entries vanish at consistent intervals," and her finger drew a pattern even skeptics could feel. Jordan Hale watched the second hand on the clock crawl like a tired witness. Victor Lang said, "Coincidence is not conspiracy," and smiled as if he had never met coincidence. Mara said, "Coincidence does not repeat with this precision, and let silence carry the rest." Judge Elias Carter said, "Partial granted," and the gavel kissed wood without romance. The order opened a narrow door, just wide enough for sunlight and danger to enter together. Jordan exhaled and tasted dust older than the case. The gallery murmured, and history took a small step toward the record. The apartment door hung straight, yet the lock answered with a new rattle that did not belong. Jordan Hale stepped in slow and counted shadows as if they might try to pass for furniture. A white envelope crouched on the floor like a warning that had been practicing. He opened it and read 3 words, "Withdraw by Monday." Jordan said, You do not own my calendar, and folded the paper as if that could fold a threat. The sink tap wept a slow beat that no one had invited. Mara Quinn said, "Safe house now," over the phone, and her tone allowed no debate. Jordan said, "If I run, they win," and stared at the notch above the hinge where a pry had kissed the frame. The radiator clicked like a metronome that had learned to lie. He packed a fresh notebook, a spare shirt, and a courage that needed rehearsal. Liam Cross said, "Document the damage," and the shutter sound felt like a promise to tomorrow. The letter returned to the table, but its shadow stayed in his chest. By noon the airwaves filled with smiles that bit. Corporate counsel Ruth Kincaid, a 52-year-old female, said, "Our audit shows no fraud," and the anchor nodded like a metronome. Victor Lang said, "The defense seeks headlines in a clip that traveled faster than facts." Liam Cross said, "We go live at 6, and typed with a tempo that matched the city's pulse." Jordan Hale watched an old yearbook photo appear on screen, dragged out as if youth were a verdict. A former supervisor said, "He always wanted attention," and the knife slid in under the ribs of memory. Mara Quinn said, "This is standard character warfare," and handed him a clean statement with sharp edges. Jordan said, "Numbers hurt people when they lie," and the sentence felt like armor he could afford. The plaza outside trembled with cables and lights, eager for drama and reluctant for nuance. A cloud bank swallowed the sun and returned the day to gray. The storm had chosen a name, and it was his. The record's vault breathed dust and cold, and the lights hummed like a lie trying to sound harmless. Helen Voss, a 55-year-old female records officer, said, "Sign here for sealed attachments," and slid a ledger across steel. Mara Quinn said, "We need the consent decree addenda," and her pen moved with practiced calm. Jordan Hale said, "Show us what the docket never wanted seen," and watched the lock turn with a grudging click. The box held a stapled appendix with a clause that looked ordinary until it did not. Mara said, "Mirror storage required off-site," and her finger stopped on a line buried after boilerplate. Jordan said, "Then a copy survives somewhere," and hope flickered like a match in a draft. Helen Voss said, "Archive vendor listed, but audits are blank," and the blank felt intentional. The clause named a protocol that sounded noble and hid like a trap. Mara said, "We trace the vendor, then compel the mirror, and the plan sharpened by necessity." Jordan pictured deletions bending around a safeguard like water around stone. The vault doors sighed shut behind them, and the past felt closer than the hallway. The data center growled like a storm in a cage, and the cold bit through coats and certainty. Owen Price, a 50-year-old male custodian, said, "Visitor log only," and held a clipboard like a shield. Mara Quinn said, "Court order permits inspection," and presented the narrow door they had won. Jordan Hale said, "We need environmental and access logs," and the word need refused to blink. Nora Bell said, "Chain begins at the cage seal," and her phone camera ticked each label. Owen Price said, "Backups rotate nightly," and his gaze skipped a quarter inch to the left. Jordan said, "Then last Tuesday exists or your contract is fiction," and the hum seemed to listen. A row of cold drives blinked with the patience of glaciers. Mara said, "Receipt the mirror lot numbers," and Owen wrote as if the ink might testify. Security radios crackled, then quieted, and the room learned a new respect for silence. They left with numbers that felt like coordinates, and a draft of proof in their breath. The deposition room was small enough to force honesty to sit close. Evan Pike, a 29-year-old male junior accountant, said, "They called it continuity," and his eyes fixed on the carafe instead of faces. Victor Lang said, "Answer narrowly," and his smile warned more than it welcomed. Mara Quinn said, "State the instruction you received," and slid a highlight pen forward. Evan Pike said, "Use sandbox credentials for late adjustments," and the words tried to hide behind the table. Jordan Hale felt the floor tilt as a pattern found its shape. Evan Pike said, "The memo title was Continuity White Paper, and the date harvested the room of oxygen." Mara said, was the sandbox mapped to production, and her tone carried a calm blade. Evan Pike said, under an alias that matched a night shift, and the clock ticked once too loudly. Victor Lang said speculation, and the court reporter's keys answered with impartial clicks. Jordan wrote the alias down, and saw the door to the mirror widen. Truth did not raise its voice, it simply refused to leave. The law library stacked night against the glass, and the lamps painted islands of focus across oak. Mara Quinn said, Clause 9.3, and her fingertips slowed at a footnote that had been hiding in plain sight. Jordan Hale said, vendor must escrow keys with the court, and the sentence hit like a bell rung far away. Liam Cross, a 38-year-old male reporter, said, if the keys exist, the mirror breathes, and steel entered his whisper. Nora Bell said, escrow officer listed as retired, and pulled an address that smelled of dust and decades. Mara said, we move ex parte for preservation, and the urgency left no room for ceremony. Jordan said the alias from the sandbox links to the night shift, and the thread finally found a needle. The footnote mapped a path under the arguments that had been thrown like smoke. Liam said, public will understand a key, and the story found a heartbeat shaped like a lock. The page edges rasped like flint striking. The night did not get lighter, but their path did. The hallway outside Chambers carried the smell of varnish and old arguments, and the day balanced on its toes. Ruth Kincaid, a 52-year-old female corporate counsel, said, withdraw your motion or face sanctions, and handed a document that grinned. Victor Lang said, your mirror fantasy is theater, and the consonants landed like coins on marble. Mara Quinn said, your objections fear daylight, and her posture held like a spar set for wind. Jordan Hale said, keys in escrow mean the past remembers, and his voice found steel it had earned. Dan Mercer, a 36-year-old male analyst, stood at the far bench and tried to look like a stranger. Liam Cross said, we are on record at 6, and the threat was simply context. Ruth Kincaid said, you will not like discovery turned inward, and a chill took the corridor. Mara said, we do not fear our own files, and the hallway learned which side would blink. The clerk opened the door, and the next hearing swallowed the noise. The mirror waited, and so did the reckoning. Dawn scraped the courthouse cornice, and found a line of resolve that was starting to fray. Mara Quinn said, our preservation order is ready, and her voice wore armor polished by sleepless hours. Jordan Hale said, something moved before we did, and watched a courier pass Ruth Kincaid, a smile shaped like leverage. Victor Lang said, emergency stay entered, and the paper slapped the marble with quiet glee. Nora Bell said, anonymous complaint alleges mishandled exhibits, and shame tried to borrow her breath. Liam Cross said, we can counter with daylight, and tightened his grip on a notebook that had seen too much rain. Judge Elias Carter said, counsel in Chambers, and the hall shifted as if pulled by an invisible rope. Ruth Kincaid said, your mirror request contaminates the record, and her consonants clipped like shears. Mara said, truth is not a contaminant, and the stillness took sides without speaking. Jordan said, if they fear the mirror, it holds more than reflection, and the thought steadied his hands. The clerk opened the door, and confidence faltered as a rumor of betrayal crossed the threshold first. The day had begun with courage, and now it asked for a cost. The newsroom glass boxed the city like an exhibit, and the meeting table reflected faces that did not match their words. Liam Cross said, legal wants a softer segment, and the compromise sounded like a bruise. Jordan Hale said, soft kills what matters, and watched a producer tally risk as if it were currency. Mara Quinn said, accuracy is not defamation, and slid corroboration across fingerprints and doubt. The executive producer said, we air the garage audio, and the room practiced not flinching. Jordan said, that clip is cut to frame me, and the syllables hit the pane with dull thuds. Liam Cross said, I argued for context, and his eyes admitted a defeat he disliked. The editor said, public trusts pictures more than memos, and the screen filled with grain that bent truth. Mara said, "You will mislead," and the projector whirred like a conscience turning away. Liam Cross said, "I am outvoted," and the sentence took a piece of him on the way out. Jordan felt loyalty shed its skin and leave something colder. The city beyond the glass blinked, hungry and impatient. The hearing returned like a tide with a memory for footprints, and the gallery carried the aftertaste of headlines. Victor Lang said, "Defense consorted with a wired witness," and the edit rolled across a screen that hid its stitches. Dan Mercer said, "He asked me to help him," and the lie borrowed posture from fear. Jordan Hale said, "Play the full recording," and hope tested the length of the judge's patience. Mara Quinn said, "Foundation is defective," and her objection built a staircase to caution. Judge Elias Carter said, "Overruled for now," and the gavel sounded tired of everyone. The clip showed the wire, the chrome, and omitted the threat tucked under the noise. Jordan said, "I told him to remove it," and the missing seconds mocked him with silence. Nora Bell said, "Metadata shows cuts," and the fact waited for a door that did not open. Victor Lang said, "Convenient," and the smile before his eyes arrived. The order narrowed discovery and widened doubt, and air left the room through an unseen crack. The tide had returned, and it took ground with it. Night pressed against the safehouse glass, and learned the shape of their fear. Jordan Hale said, "Door sensors chirped at 2:07, and the hour arrived like a ghost with paperwork." Mara Quinn said, "We changed the locks, then the plan," and her calm scratched sparks from panic. Nora Bell said, "I clicked a shipping alert this morning," and guilt turned her posture smaller. Jordan said, "Phishing burned our address," and the radiator answered with a teeth-chattering rattle. Liam Cross said, "I can post a retraction thread," and the room measured whether that would swim or sink. A shadow crossed the porch, paused, and left a scuff in the frost as if signing a receipt. Mara said, "We move now," and packed the mirror coordinates with hands that had sworn better days. Jordan said, "Trust is an artery," and felt how thin it had become. Nora Bell said, "I will own the breach," and steadied her eyes like a witness finding oath. The night waited to see who would lock it out. The house exhaled, then went still. The escrow officer's bungalow smelled like paper and winter citrus, and the past lived in labeled tins. Harold Mears, a 71-year-old male retiree, said, "I kept the keys like scripture," and slid a ledger that did not know how to lie. Mara Quinn said, "We need the release protocol," and traced a line that dated back to the Grant night. Jordan Hale said, "Log the checkout at 2:07, and his stomach recognized the hour as if it were a scar. Harold Mears said, "Credentials used match counsel," and turned a page that made the room colder. Mara said, "Whose credentials?" and the question arrived with iron in its coat. Harold Mears said, "Mara Quinn," and the name did not fit the mouth that heard it. Jordan said, "That is forgery," and the word felt both heavy and insufficient. Liam Cross said, "This is the story if we survive it," and the recorder caught the rasp of doubt. Nora Bell said, "Alias mapped to her login," and the pattern closed its circle like a trap. Mara said, "Someone borrowed my name," and the silence signed the affidavit. Outside, the wind pushed at the eaves, eager for a verdict. The recording room held its breath while an old speaker crackled to life with a voice that wore Mara's face without her soul. Harold Mears said, "Escrow challenge phrase?" and the reply matched Mara Quinn down to the cut of her vowels. Mara Quinn said, "That is not me," and the denial sounded like a bridge catching fire. Jordan Hale said, "Who has a perfect copy of you?" and trust bent under a weight it did not choose. Liam Cross said, "Hear the shimmer at 9 kilohertz, and pointed at a spectral smear like a fingerprint made of air. Nora Bell said, "Cloned from the deposition audio," and the room tilted toward a new edge. Ruth Kincaid said, "Your client's team orchestrated this," in a statement on the screen that arrived before fax. Victor Lang said, "Counsel's credentials speak for themselves," and the headline wrote itself with a sneer. Mara said, "Someone stole my name and borrowed my mouth," and the line hurt more than the lie. Harold Mears said. The ledger ties to a spoofed callback, and flipped a page that made the floor colder. Jordan said, we find the studio that built this voice, and his resolve found iron where doubt had slept. The speaker clicked off, and the silence accused the wrong person first. The alley behind the station smelled of ozone and old fear, and Dan Mercer stepped from a shadow as if he belonged to it. Dan Mercer said, I can point you to the studio, and guilt hung on him like a loan that would not close. Jordan Hale said, why help now, and measured the tremor in Dan's hands. Dan said, because I recorded that call to save myself. And shame found a throat to borrow. Mara Quinn said, you burned me with my own voice, and the sentence held steady because something had to. Liam Cross said, name the engineer, and his pen waited for a name that carried teeth. Dan Mercer said Mitchell Crane, a 42-year-old male contractor off books, and the alley swallowed the echo. Nora Bell said location, and Dan passed a torn receipt with a unit number like a dare. Jordan said, we verify, we do not bargain, and the rule anchored them against the pull of rage. Dan said, I was told the mirror would erase the pain, and the lie he had believed fell apart in his hands. The rain started thin and grew teeth, as if the sky wanted the last word. The storage unit door rolled up like a stage curtain on a show that hated applause. Jordan Hale said, do not touch the drives yet, and his voice knew the cost of haste. Nora Bell said, lot numbers matched the mirror list, and photographed serials that glittered like quiet knives. Liam Cross said, power 1 for a checksum only, and cautious hope took its first breath. The screen blinked a directory named Continuity White Paper, and dread knelt beside curiosity. Mara Quinn said, open the mail archive, and a thread unfolded from Ruth Kincaid to Victor Lang with dates that hurt to read. Jordan said, sandbox alias maps to a night shift bot, and the pattern finally admitted its architect. Nora Bell said, checksum validates, and the proof wore chain mail. Liam Cross said, we publish after the court sees it, and the restraint left fingerprints on his patients. Jordan said, we copy, seal, and move, and the unit felt smaller because the truth had mass. Outside, the rain thickened into a wall that asked who would push through it. By morning, the motion to disqualify arrived dressed as concern and armed like a blade. Victor Lang said, counsel's identity compromise poisons the well, and the argument pretended to protect the court. Ruth Kincaid said, we regret this necessity, and the ink smiled as it cut. Mara Quinn said, I will not be the reason this case dies, and her eyes found a horizon past pride. Jordan Hale said, we fight this together, and felt the risk crawl under his ribs. Judge Elias Carter said, counsel meet in chambers, and the gallery braced for a verdict that could end the story early. Liam Cross said, if you step aside, we lose ground, and his conviction knocked once against caution. Mara said, sometimes ground must be traded to save the climb, and the room learned the shape of sacrifice. Jordan said, I choose the case over comfort, and the line cut both ways. The order arrived, narrow and merciless, and Mara's name slid from the caption like a ring from a cold finger. The silence that followed was loyal to no one. Night returned with a habit of bad timing, and the team gathered in a borrowed studio that still remembered applause. Jordan Hale said, play the raw mirror voicemail, and the speakers bared a background whisper that had escaped the first listen. Liam Cross said, that is Victor's cadence, and the room froze as if language had drawn a weapon. Nora Bell said, layer reveals a coach beneath the clone, and the spectrogram split like a curtain. Jordan said, we file an emergency motion with authenticated audio, and purpose replaced grief by inches. Dan Mercer said, I can swear to the setup, and the courage he brought shook like new glass. Mara Quinn said, do it without my name on the caption, and the generosity landed like a bruise. Ruth Kincaid appeared on a late feed claiming outrage at unknown actors, and the lie wore pearls. Jordan said, the mirror remembers everyone, and the case found a spine stiff enough for storms. Outside, sirens braided through the dark like a clock on fire, and the city leaned toward a reckoning it could no longer dodge. The emergency hearing began under a sky the color of old slate, and the courtroom felt wired to a live storm. Judge Elias Carter said, "Authenticate the proffered audio," and patients perched like a hawk. Nora Bell said, "Chain of custody documented from capture to checksum," and slid a log that did not blink. Liam Cross said, "Second track reveals a coaching layer," and the spectrogram bloomed like a bruise. Victor Lang said, "Audio, illusions mislead," and his calm tried to outrun the facts. Jordan Hale said, "Play it," and the speakers gave them a whisper that wore victory like a mask. Mara Quinn stood in the aisle, barred from counsel table, and said, "My voice is not this voice," and the room believed her bones. Ruth Kincaid said, "Coincidence remains plausible," and the word coincidence begged for shelter. Nora Bell said, 9 kilohertz phasing anchors the overdub, and science opened the door. Judge Elias Carter said, "Admitted for limited purpose," and the gavel sounded like a fuse. Jordan exhaled and tasted copper resolve. The gallery shifted, learning where balance would fall. The storm outside found its echo inside, and truth began to take the microphone back. The expert took the stand with a calm that came from years of noise. Dr. Keegan Ward, a 48-year-old male audio forensics analyst, said artifacts indicate composite speech, and the waveform obeyed his finger. Victor Lang said, "Could random interference produce this?" and hope masqueraded as rigor. Dr. Keegan Ward said, "Not with this persistence and harmonic alignment," and numbers sat down like witnesses. Jordan Hale watched the jury lean in, lured by math that felt like truth with teeth. Ruth Kincaid said, "Your lab works for media clients," and bias tried to rent a room. Dr. Keegan Ward said, "Standards are blind to paychecks," and the room liked that sentence. Mara Quinn, silent by order, traced dates in her notebook as if time could be convinced. Nora Bell said, "Cross-correlate with the escrow ledger," and the timestamp circled back to 27 like a returning tide. The judge nodded once, inviting gravity. The screen froze on a layer where Victor's cadence hid like a watermark. The gallery murmured, then hushed. Thorm gained structure, and it pointed. The mirror drives waited on a cart like patient animals, and the clerk rolled them forward as if delivering weather. Judge Elias Carter said, "Foundation established," and the seal straps snapped with ceremony. Jordan Hale said, "Open continuity white paper," and the directory bloomed with emails that smelled of heat. Liam Cross said, "Read the thread from the Grant Knight," and the words stitched motive to method. Ruth Kincaid said, "Objection, privilege," and the objection reached for a ladder that was not there. Mara Quinn stared at an entry where her login walked without her legs. Nora Bell said, "Alias resolves to a service account masked as counsel," and the mask slipped. Victor Lang said, "Irrelevant to the charged conduct," and the sentence arrived late. Jordan said, "It shows intent to fabricate," and the jury felt the floor tilt. The judge admitted the thread, limited but lethal. The mirror had turned witness, and its memory did not flinch. Outside, the sky brightened by a degree, as if the storm sensed arrival. Cross-examination arrived like a blade wrapped in velvet. Jordan Hale said, "Mr. Lang, did you instruct Dan Mercer to wear a wire?" and the room shrank to the space between two breaths. Victor Lang said, "No," and his eyes blinked on a rhythm that the audio had already learned. Jordan said, "Play the coaching layer at the marked timestamp," and the whisper stepped into daylight. Victor Lang said, "That is fabrication," and the jury stayed with the screen, not his mouth. Liam Cross said, "Note the cadence match," and the expert nodded without flair. Ruth Kincaid said, "Counsel badgers the witness," and the word badger tried to stand taller than proof. Judge Elias Carter said, "Overruled," and the bench carried the weight. Jordan said, "Whose voice instructs the witness to mention the mirror?" and silence tried to help Victor and failed. Mara Quinn looked at the ceiling and let the fight move without her name on it. The whisper kept speaking, and denial kept shrinking. The blade came out of its wrap, and it cut clean. The verdict phase marched in with the gravity of winter. Judge Elias Carter said, "On the petition and related sanctions," and the words mapped a cliff edge. The court found that fabrication tainted the prosecution's exhibit and narrowed the path to truth. Victor Lang said, "We reserve all rights," and the sentence sounded like a door closing on a room now on fire. Ruth Kincaid said, "No fraud proven against my client," and the shield she lifted looked thin. Jordan Hale felt victory and loss stacking like plates he could not carry together. The court admitted the mirror archive in full and referred the coaching layer for investigation. Mara Quinn said, "Let the record breathe," and the line stitched hope to restraint. Liam Cross said, "We go live with documents, not adjectives," and his resolve matched the hour. Nora Bell said, "Chain verified end to end, and the case found a spine that would not bend." The gavel fell, not like thunder but like a lock turning. The storm ended without sun, but the air tasted cleaner. The city readied itself for the reckoning of Act 7. Dawn found the plaza littered with cables and questions, and the city stared at its reflection with something like shame. Jordan Hale said, "We did not win, we survived," and the words tasted like rain on iron. Mara Quinn said, "Survival buys time for justice," and the phrase tried to stand taller than fatigue. Liam Cross said, "Documents at 6 sharp," and his voice promised facts instead of triumph. Nora Bell said, "Chain log filed to the clerk," and relief flickered, but did not dare to glow. Ruth Kincaid said, "My client will audit internally," and the spin curled tight around a hollow center. Victor Lang said, "No wrongdoing established," and the microphones learned how denial breathes when cornered. Jordan looked up at the courthouse frieze and saw ordinary stone pretending to be history. He thought of the nurse, the janitor, and the steady bleed of small losses that had funded a lie. Mara said, "When they reopen the books, some harm can still be stopped," and hope returned wearing work boots. Jordan said, "Then we go page by page," and the day agreed to begin again. The storm had passed, but the ground it soaked would grow something new, and it would remember who watered it. The community hall smelled of coffee and church basement hope, and folding chairs arranged themselves like quiet witnesses. Jordan Hale said, "I owe you the truth before anyone else," and the room answered with soft, stubborn eyes. A night shift nurse said, "We lost years to a ledger that lied," and the sentence shook without breaking. Mara Quinn said, "Restitution rides behind proof," and she spread forms that could teach money to apologize. Liam Cross said, "I will publish payback pathways, not just villains," and journalism remembered the people who bleed. Nora Bell said, "We found the bot that erased your hours," and she laid the alias on the table like a shed skin. An old janitor said, "I kept the notices because paper does not lie as fast," and he smiled without joy. Jordan said, "Your names will never be footnotes," and the promise clicked into him like a gear finding teeth. The hall warmed, not with victory, but with repair learning to stand. They built a list, a timeline, and a map that pointed from hurt to remedy. Outside, children shouted, and the noise sounded like a future that might accept them back. The Riverwalk kept the city honest by repeating it without adjectives, and Dan Mercer waited on a bench that had seen easier confessions. Dan Mercer said, "They will indict me," and the words arrived without costume. Jordan Hale said, "Tell the whole chain and stop editing your life," and sat at a distance measured by memory. Dan said, "I wanted an exit and mistook the mirror for a door, and shame rode the wind like grit." Mara Quinn said, "Name who paid Mitchell Crane," and guided the pen toward the bruise that mattered. Dan said, "A shell funded by counsel's vendor," and the receipt in his pocket found daylight. Liam Cross said, "Off record ends now," and the phrase meant mercy with a spine. Nora Bell said, "We will verify wire roots and return what can be returned," and the river nodded. Jordan said, "You can still be the witness you failed to be," and the offer hung above the water like a bridge. Dan signed, then folded into the bench as if steel had left his legs. The city moved on both banks, and the current carried a different story than yesterday. The final hearing did not roar, it cut, and the room understood the difference. Judge Elias Carter said, "Sanctions and referrals are ordered," and the syllables moved like chisels through marble. Ruth Kincaid said, "We accept independent monitoring," and the concession arrived wrapped as prudence. Victor Lang said, "No admission," and the phrase collapsed under the weight of the record. Jordan Hale said, "Remediation, plan appended for victims," and the clerk stamped a path from paper to payment. Mara Quinn stood along the rail like weather that had chosen to stay, and she let the results speak without her name. Nora Bell said, "Mirror archive to public docket," and 1,000 pages remembered how to breathe. Liam Cross said, "Tonight, we run the receipts," and the story traded heat for light. The gallery did not cheer, because endings that matter do not wear confetti. The gavel fell, and the room carried the impression of an honest bruise. Justice had not sung, but it had spoken clearly, and that would have to be enough for this hour. Night took the city back and left the courthouse lit like a lighthouse for people who cannot swim yet. Jordan Hale said, "Legend is just a name people give survivors," and the line surprised him with its temperature. Mara Quinn said, "You did not chase a legend, you chased a ledger," and correction fit the air. Liam Cross said, "Tomorrow the city reads itself," and for once the promise did not sound like a threat. Nora Bell said, "We will keep the mirror breathing," and tucked the chain log away like a heartbeat. The plaza emptied, and footsteps wrote small sentences across wet stone. Jordan touched the groove in his notebook where truth had once been carved by a shaking hand. He thought of the first report at the kitchen table, and of every mile between that night and this light. Mara said, "Go home, then come back," and the order carried gentleness inside steel. Jordan said, "The past is loud, but we are louder," and the words stayed to keep the building company. The wind turned, and the city listened.